When I was growing up, no one wanted to be a wasp, at least in the contexts that I was in. And so I would joke about being a wasp. And one time I did that in front of my mother, and she, coming from a context where people did want to be a wasp, was like, "You can't be a wasp. You have a French last name and 3 Catholic grandparents." Which, it's funny because my mother was the one who raised me in a mainline Protestant denomination in New England. And the reference, what I was joking about, is New England, if you are familiar with it, especially rural New England, is still very culturally Calvinist, even for people who are not Calvinist. Secular people especially, but Catholics as well, tend to be very waspy. Certainly my mother picked up a lot of waspy traits herself. But I've been thinking about this persistence of culture in connection to 2 books. So I mentioned I read this one recently about the history of French Canadians in New England. And then this one I've wanted to talk about for a while, because this is a book that, at least like in the 2010s, all the wannabe conservative intellectuals would talk about this book and would generally get it kind of wrong. And I just kept seeing it because I was a libertarian, so I'd see these kinds of people showing up in the spaces I was in talking about this book. And so I read it, and so basically his thesis, David Hackett Fischer's thesis, is that you had 4 big waves of migration to the US that shaped US culture, both persistently where they came from and then shaping the wider US culture as they fused, as they engaged with each other, as they sort of merged together. And these 3 cultural waves were the Puritans to New England, so the Calvinists to New England, the Cavaliers to Virginia and the Tidewater area, the Quakers to the Midlands, and then the Scots-Irish to the backcountry. And like if you look at a map, a cultural map in New England, like I remember I saw a map of the big 5 personality traits of the US, and there was a pretty shallow gradient on most of them, with the exception of neuroticism, where most of the US was various shades of gray, and then New England was black. And I've been trying to find that map again, but the culture of New England, just no matter what religion you're in, especially in rural New England, there is a tendency towards this Calvinist, very neurotic, very guilt-based self-examination. I won't really get into that here. This is just going to be a short video on the idea of the question of how persistent is culture and when does it persist, because I thought about this idea again after reading this book, where he is arguing that even after losing their language and often Catholic religion, the French Canadians, the Franco-Americans, still maintained culture. And some of the things he talked about, I'm like, oh yeah, that actually is consistent with my grandfather and my father. And so my grandfather's grandfather married a WASP woman, and then his son, my grandfather's father, married a WASP woman, and then my grandfather married a WASP woman. My father was the first of that line since coming to the US to marry a woman who was raised Catholic, and my mother was a lapsed Catholic who, again, raised her kids mainline Protestant-ish. So my mother was not like ethnically WASP, what was kind of culturally as well, despite her reaction. But 2 of the things that he talked about in terms of this culture of the Franco-Americans is an opposition to complaining and relatively low ambition. And I never had either of those initially, but under the influence of my father and seeing how it worked from him, I ended up scaling my ambitions back a lot and also complaining a lot less. So I don't know if it's actually the case that this is specifically Franco-American culture, if it's my family or what, but certainly my father, who had 3 WASP grandparents, was more laid back and less stereotypically waspy than my mother, who had 4 Catholic grandparents. But I think, again, you have this, the New England culture has persisted even as most New Englanders today are not descended mostly from WASP, but are mostly descended from Catholic immigrants. So I don't really have any wider thoughts on that question. It's just something I've been thinking about, and it will get to something I want to talk about in future videos. But I wanted to bring up this book because, as I said, it's a book that is popular with a certain kind of people who tend to misinterpret it. So this is a way to introduce it, and I'm going to have another video talking about another one of his books too. Yeah, so that's all for today. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and I'll see you all in the next one.